1933 marks the beginning of the darkest chapter in German history. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party assume power in Germany. Since that time, the image of Germany and the Germans in the world has changed, and the shadows of the past are omnipresent even today.
Part 2 in the series on Hitler and the Holocaust. April 1933 marked the beginning of an era that would redefine cruelty, injustice, and the depths of human suffering. With the implementation of boycotts, discriminatory laws, and public displays of hatred, Nazi Germany signaled that a dark chapter was unfolding, one that would escalate into an unprecedented horror. Jewish citizens, once integral to German society, were vilified, excluded, and stripped of basic rights. Businesses were shut down, lives were dismantled, propaganda poisoned minds, turning neighbors into enemies and indifference into complicity.
His hatred of Jews knows no limits. Jewish citizens are ostracized from the national community, persecuted and ultimately methodically murdered in death factories.
The entire National Socialist history is about radicalizations. They only hazarded one step at a time, and then another, and another. And in wartime, it's a lot easier to enforce radical measures.
The dawn of persecution and the road to tragedy. This is Germany after World War I, the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, and the ideology of racial purity and its foundation in Nazi thought. This was not an isolated injustice. It was a calculated effort, one carefully orchestrated and deliberately executed by Hitler and his regime.
In the spring of 1933, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda stages a march by members of the Stormtroopers at the Brandenburg Gate with a film camera. The resulting motion picture reenacts the night in which Hitler assumed power in Germany. The Third Reich is only a few months old, and already the Nazi leaders are beginning to glorify their own history. On the morning of the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler leaves Hotel Kaiserhof in Berlin among a cheering crowd of supporters. At 11 o'clock, he is to be appointed Chancellor of Germany by Reich President von Hindenburg. This day will become a turning point in the history of the 20th century. Franz von Papen is at Hitler's side during the presentation of the new cabinet. The National Conservative Vice-Chancellor believes he can keep Hitler in check and maintains, "We've hired him."
Hitler didn't have any blueprint in mind at that time. His main ideas were to get new elections, following the elections to have an enabling act, and to acquire power in the various Länder, in the various states like Bavaria and Saxony, and finally, of course, obviously to destroy his internal enemies. I think those were the main points that Hitler had in mind when he took power in 1933. Beyond that, no clear idea of how things would develop.
To celebrate Hitler's appointment, gangs of the Stormtroopers march through the Brandenburg Gate and into Berlin's government district in the evening. Reich President von Hindenburg can be seen as a faint silhouette at the window. A journalist of the time prophetically comments that Hitler's appointment as Reich Chancellor equals a leap into darkness.
As the years progressed, legislation tightened around Jewish families, forcing them out of public life and into despair. Books were burned, voices were silenced, and terror took hold of the streets. In the shadows of society, plans were underway to take oppression even further. The first concentration camps emerged, not as places of mass murder yet, but as tools of fear, imprisonment, and brutal labor. The first of these camps became a grim prototype, a training ground for cruelty, a blueprint for suffering.
Having been appointed the new Interior Minister of Prussia, Hermann Göring is in control of the police. Hitler's unscrupulous advocate is determined to exploit his power without mercy.
Ich werde mit eisernem Besen auskehren und alle diejenigen, die ausschließlich wegen ihrer roten oder schwarzen Gesinnung und zur Unterdrückung aller nationalen Bestrebungen in Amt und Würden sitzen, hinausreden.
A re-election is scheduled for the 5th of March. On the 10th of February, the Nazis organize a political rally where they declare war on the communists. Hitler's appearance is filmed and screened in cinemas all over Germany.
He had this great love for the German people, and he managed to convey this skillfully in his speeches. People saw in him their redeemer, with virtually religious overtones.
Sachsenhausen followed, reinforcing the Nazis' tightening grip on those deemed unworthy of existence. These were the early steps toward something far worse, a prelude to genocide, an escalation toward the unthinkable. What began as exclusion turned into forced labor, starvation, humiliation, and later the machinery of mass death. And yet, in the face of rising tyranny, the world hesitated.
He was someone who was saying to them, I know things are really bad for you, unemployment is very high, but you still have something special. You are members of the German people. And all the other peoples who are not German are not as worthy as you are.
Wir wollen nicht lügen und wollen nicht schwindeln. Ich habe deshalb es abgelehnt, jemals vor dieses Volk hinzutreten und billige Versprechungen zu geben. Es kann niemand hier gegen mich aufstehen und zeigen, dass ich je gesagt habe, der Wiederaufstieg Deutschlands sei nur eine Frage von wenigen Tagen. Immer und immer wieder predige ich, der Wiederaufstieg der deutschen Nation ist die Frage der Wiedergewinnung der inneren Kraft und Gesundheit des deutschen Volkes.
The Democratic parties don't stand a chance against the Nazi rhetoric.
Some resisted, many looked away, and a tragic number accepted the escalating horrors as inevitable. The first wave of oppression, April 1st, 1933. The nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses.
Stormtroopers and police hunt down Social Democrat and Communist functionaries. Thousands are murdered or interned in so-called protective custody camps. This film from a camp in Halle is shown in local cinemas as a deterrent. Berlin, the 1st of April 1933. The day on which the brutality of the new era manifests itself openly for the first time. Hitler's cabinet has called for a countrywide boycott of Jewish shops.
The actual boycott was a shock for Germans. It all happened out of the blue. One day, people in uniform were standing outside the shops and wouldn't let anybody in. It was an overt message to the Jewish citizens all over Germany that they couldn't be part of the national community because they belong to another race or don't have the right ancestry.
The turning point. It was an ordinary day in the calendar for many, but for Jewish communities across Germany, it was the first undeniable signal that their livelihoods, dignity, and very existence were under siege. The Nazi regime, having recently seized power, wasted no time in asserting its ideology of exclusion and destruction. The boycott of Jewish businesses was not merely an economic restriction. It was a declaration, a message to the people of Germany and the world that the Nazi government would spare no effort in implementing racial persecution on an unprecedented scale.
Contrary to the claims of the propaganda machinery, the boycott is not particularly successful. Many customers simply ignore the posters and signs of the stormtroopers. For German Jews, however, the day will become a traumatic memory.
In Berlin, wie in anderen Universitätsstädten Deutschlands, wurden undeutsche und unsittliche Bücher von den Studenten eingesammelt und öffentlich verbrannt. Der Scheiterhaufen auf dem Opernplatz in Berlin.
To understand the gravity of this event, we must step back and examine the political and social landscape that made it possible, the economic desperation that fueled scapegoating, the propaganda machine that convinced the masses, and the public response that determined whether this cruelty would take root or be rejected. The path to the boycott. Germany in the early 1930s was in chaos. The devastating effects of World War I had left the nation humiliated, struggling under the weight of economic hardship and desperate for a leader who would restore its greatness. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed harsh penalties, leaving millions in financial ruin. The Great Depression had further exacerbated the suffering, leading many to search for answers or for someone to blame. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party provided that answer. Their rhetoric, grounded in anti-Semitic conspiracies, painted Jewish communities as the enemy, the reason for Germany's failures, the ones standing in the way of the country's rebirth. This dangerous myth was spread through speeches, literature, and media, preparing German society to accept discrimination as justified. The groundwork for persecution had been carefully laid, and all that remained was action.
The way the totalitarian regime takes control of the entire nation within a few years is unprecedented.
On the morning of April 1st, 1933, Nazi stormtroopers stood outside Jewish businesses across Germany. They blocked entrances, painted messages of hatred on shop windows, and urged customers to turn away. Across the country, shops closed their doors, some in fear, others forced by intimidation. Jewish doctors, lawyers, and other professionals found their offices vandalized, their livelihoods stolen from them in a single stroke. The boycott was framed as retaliation against an alleged international Jewish conspiracy seeking to harm Germany through economic means. In reality, it was the first major test of Nazi influence, an attempt to normalize discrimination and set the stage for further persecution. While the boycott officially lasted only a day, its consequences echoed far beyond April 1st. How did the German people respond? This question is central to understanding the role of public complicity in historical atrocities. Some viewed the boycott with unease, uncomfortable with such open hostility. Others remained indifferent, believing the measures would not escalate further. And then there were those who embraced the propaganda, who saw Jewish suffering as necessary for national revival.
Hitler uses the opportunity to settle the score with his political opponents. An emergency decree suspends most civil liberties in Germany. The newspapers of the Communist and Social Democratic parties are banned and many functionaries arrested. The police are encouraged to use their weapons without hesitation against so-called subversive organizations and demonstrators. Nazi combat groups are given police powers. Working-class leaders who have just finished their speeches in front of huge audiences are driven out of the union buildings by gangs of thugs.
For the Jewish community, the boycott was a wake-up call, a realization that the nation they had contributed to, fought for, and called home was turning against them. The doors that had once welcomed them were closing. Friends and colleagues were becoming silent bystanders. The legal measures that followed in the coming months, the exclusion of Jews from civil service, education, and professional fields, were a direct extension of what happened on April 1st, 1933. The persecution would not stop at economic oppression. It would intensify into something far worse.
Hitler proclaims the 1st of May a national holiday, thus satisfying an old demand of the labor unions. Goebbels stages the appearance of the Führer on Berlin's Tempelhof airfield, designed to have an all-encompassing effect.
Ist nicht mehr das Volk der Ehrlosigkeit, der Schande, der Selbstableichung, der Gleichmütigkeit und Kleingläubigkeit. Nein, Herr, das deutsche Volk ist wieder stark geworden in seinem Geiste, stark in seinem Willen, stark in seiner Beharrlichkeit, stark im Ertragen aller Opfer. Herr, wir lassen nicht von dir.
For the first time, Adolf Hitler is visually presented as the shining light of the new folk community. On the following day, the last remaining democratic labor organizations in Germany are done away with.
The boycott was not an isolated act. It was a foundation, a precedent. With Jewish businesses marked and economic participation restricted, Hitler and his regime had successfully tested the waters. The German people had been conditioned to accept exclusion, and this acceptance would make future policies forced deportations, concentration camps, and ultimately genocide easier to implement. Over the next years, laws were passed that would make it nearly impossible for Jewish citizens to participate in German society. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 officially stripped them of citizenship. In 1938, attacks on Jewish businesses escalated into physical destruction.
A laborer during the Weimar Republic didn't know what holiday was. By the end of the Third Reich, every worker had a legal right to 14 days vacation a year. It was something that was introduced then, along with other elements contributing to leisure time and enjoyment of life in general, things that didn't exist before. In the eyes of the Germans, the credit for all this was due to their Führer.
In the face of 6 million jobless Germans, Hitler leads the population to believe that mass unemployment can be combated through the construction of autobahns and other costly economy-stimulating measures. Those who appear unimpressed by the spirit of optimism or offer resistance to the dictatorship are mercilessly persecuted by Hitler's henchmen. Hermann Göring has one of the first so-called re-education centers built in Oranienburg near Berlin. Unlike the Nazi propaganda suggests, people there are tortured and murdered with his consent. In Prussia alone, over 25,000 people are interned in camps. As of the 26th of April 1933, Göring augments the coercive apparatus of the Nazis with the establishment of the Gestapo, secret state police. Despite the fact that all opposition parties have been banned, spontaneous labor strikes do take place occasionally, but are quickly suppressed.
Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, saw thousands of shops and synagogues destroyed, Jewish people beaten and arrested while the world watched.
After these crises, particularly the Austrian one, there was thousands and thousands of Jews who wanted to leave the country, as Hitler slowly took a tougher and tougher line to be rid of them. Weren't big fans of the Jews anyway, but now with Beneš gone as a restraining factor, they had no tolerance for the matter at all. They were happy to toe the German line and impose anti-Jewish restrictions. In some cases, they were even more eager than the Germans and began to deport these Jews by the thousands. Again, the problem was where to put them. The obvious answer for the place to put all these Jews was Poland, the nation with the most Jews in Europe by far. The issue again was that the Polish government was incredibly anti-Semitic themselves and shuddered at the thought of thousands more Jews being pumped into the nation. In March 1938, the Poles quickly passed a law to prevent the influx of Jews that would inevitably come from Vienna, which housed thousands of Polish Jews. These Jews were stripped of their Polish citizenship rights. After the Munich Agreement, the Poles panicked even more, and they immediately implemented harsher restrictions on Jewish repatriation. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the issue, despite an overwhelming amount of the Jews being Polish Jews. The date of 31st of October was given. After that, there would be no more Polish Jews crossing back into Poland, and as a result, the last days of October were an absolute frenzy of activity on the Polish-German border. The Germans themselves were more than happy to take advantage of the deadline. They cancelled 12,000 Polish Jews' residence permits in the country, and amidst all the chaos, they sent trainloads of these Jews across the border before the Poles could figure out what on earth was going on. The Poles refused the Jews, and they ended up living a horrible refugee existence on the border of the two nations, where they relied on the Red Cross to survive. On one of these trains were 484 Polish Jews from Hanover. Most important among them was Mr. and Mrs. Greenspan and their daughters who had moved to Germany in 1911, and there they had a son, Herschel. Herschel Greenspan was to become a name that would go down in history, but for now, he was a nobody. His parents had wanted him to go to Palestine, however, he was told that he was too young and had to wait a year. Instead, it was decided that Herschel should go and stay in Paris with his aunt and uncle. In September 1936, he illegally entered France through Belgium. During the following 2 years, he lived amongst other Eastern Jews in a Paris enclave where Yiddish was spoken. He learned barely a word of French over his 2 years there and rarely met Frenchmen. His time in Paris somewhat mirrored Hitler's in Vienna. He was a wanderer, and instead of an artist, he was an inspiring poet. As he wasn't a legal resident of France, he couldn't study, and as a result, his life went nowhere. With no clear path to achieving anything, he quickly became depressed and irritable. He refused to get a job, and his aunt and uncle described him as a useless drain on their resources. On top of this, he was well known for his fiery temper and was quick to respond to verbal anti-Semitism with his fists, and due to his upbringing in Jewish schools, he was far more Jewish than his parents had been, even for Eastern Jewish standards. As a result, he made the Jewish cause in Germany his own, and the anti-Jewish sentiment there was driving him mad. To make matters worse, in late 1938, the French police were actually looking for him in order to deport him, given that he was an illegal immigrant after all. To those around him, he would rant and rave about the Jewish situation in Germany, and he was essentially a loose cannon waiting to explode. He had nothing, and he was going nowhere, with nothing to live for. All he had left was his family back in Germany, whom he missed so much, and would frequently talk about. On November the 3rd, Greenspan received a letter from his sister, and it was here that he learned of his parents' and sister's demeaning repatriation to Poland. Herschel immediately tried to shake his uncle down for money, and after wild protests, he either gave in or was robbed for 300 francs by his nephew, who then walked out. 4 days later, on the 7th of November, he turned up at the German embassy, seeking revenge. At 9:45 a.m, he told the receptionist that he was a German resident with important intelligence that he wanted to give to the most senior diplomat available. Only the second most senior official in the building, Ernst von Raff, was available to meet him. Herschel had actually walked past German Ambassador von Welzeck on his way in, who was leaving for his daily walk. Herschel walked into Raff's office and was asked to provide the document he claimed to possess. Instead, Herschel pulled out a gun and shot Raff 5 times, shouting, quote, "You're a filthy Bosch. In the name of 12,000 persecuted Jews, here is the document," end quote. Herschel did not attempt to evade the police, and he cried to them, quote, "Being a Jew is not a crime. I am not a dog. I have a right to live, and the Jewish people have a right to exist on this earth. Wherever I have been chased like an animal," end quote. The truth was, however, that Herschel had just killed a random, completely innocent man simply because he was German. In no way was this going to make things better, only worse. The victim, in fact, was under investigation by the Gestapo and wasn't even anti-Semitic. Raff died of his injuries 2 days later on the 9th of November, the 15th anniversary of the most important date in Germany, the Beer Hall Putsch. Hitler and all the others were gathered in Munich for the yearly services when they got the news. Herschel couldn't have possibly asked for worse timing. Patriotic feeling was at a maximum, and the German people were never going to be in a position to tolerate such a targeted attack. The reaction was spontaneous and immediate. Within hours, synagogues were on fire across Germany. In fact, such events were occurring all over Germany before the Führer even received the news.
Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine.
Berlin's Opernplatz stands as a symbol for Germany's Christian and humanistic traditions. Now it becomes the venue of the burning of 20,000 books. The new Minister for Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, addresses the youth.
Und der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein. Und dazu wollen wir euch erziehen. Und deshalb tut ihr gut daran, diese mitternächtige Stunde, den Ungeist der Vergangenheit, den Flammen anzuvertrauen.
Heinrich Heine had written, "Wherever they burn books, in the end, they will also burn human beings."
They stigmatized those who were a threat to the nation, including authors who had written immoral things and so on. We are healthy, and we want to be a healthy society, they said. So we don't need these subversive elements.
Words have the power to inspire, to unite, to strengthen. But words also have the power to deceive, to manipulate, and to destroy. In Nazi Germany, no individual understood this power better than Joseph Goebbels, the man who turned propaganda into a weapon, a tool that shaped minds, controlled narratives, and justified persecution. He did not merely spread misinformation. He engineered an entire reality, one in which truth was distorted and fear was manufactured. Through speeches, films, newspapers, and radio broadcasts, the Nazi regime cultivated an ideology of hatred, an ideology that paved the way for violence, for exclusion, and ultimately for genocide.
On the 11th of November 1933, Joseph Goebbels organizes Hitler's appearance in Siemensstadt, in the north of Berlin, as a demonstration for the labor force. Rapturous cheering, he writes in his diary. All of Germany is standing still. A year ago, they would have beaten us to death. Hitler knows his speech is transmitted on the radio and in public places. The newsreel is there too. Siemensstadt becomes one of the highlights in the Nazis' process of enforced conformity.
Wir haben nun gearbeitet und wir haben in diesen 9 Monaten Ungeheuerliches erreicht. Vielleicht wird manch unter Ihnen sein, der es mir nicht verzeihen kann, dass ich die marxistischen Parteien vernichtete. Aber mein Freund, ich habe die anderen genauso vernichtet.
This is how propaganda became one of the most destructive forces in modern history, how it turned neighbors against one another, and how it made an entire nation complicit in the crimes of the Third Reich. And most importantly, how this history serves as a warning, a reminder that misinformation, unchecked, can lead to catastrophe.
In less than 1 year, Adolf Hitler has consolidated his power in Germany, using the dictatorial powers he was granted and terrorizing measures, but also with the active help of the majority of the Germans. Hitler had to persuade the labor force that National Socialism would secure their future. Many farmers, on the other hand, had counted among the Nazis' most fervent supporters even before 1933.
The vast majority of farmers in Germany were heavily indebted at that time. But by early 1945, not one of them was in debt any longer. A new system of social security and income guarantee for farmers was introduced in Germany in 1933, with crop prices being subsidized by the state. However, in my view, this relationship, this association between the people and the leadership, was effectively a speculation bubble. A lot of money was pumped into agriculture, which was supposed to come back into the coffers in the future, but this wasn't possible because it was too much.
Joseph Goebbels was not merely a spokesperson, he was an artist of manipulation. Appointed Minister of Propaganda in 1933, he understood that controlling the narrative meant controlling the people. His methods were calculated, deliberate, and ruthless. He did not seek to inform, he sought to indoctrinate. From the moment Hitler rose to power, Goebbels ensured that every newspaper, radio program, and film reinforced Nazi ideology. Books that opposed the regime were burned, journalists who questioned authority were silenced, and dissenting voices were systematically erased. The message was clear: the Nazi Party was the only truth, and any contradiction, any opposition was labeled as the enemy, a tactic that allowed discrimination to flourish without resistance. Through repetition, Goebbels ensured that lies became accepted reality, and fear became the driving force behind obedience.
The Nazi regime tries to captivate the people through a series of job creation schemes. Approximately 1 billion Reichsmarks are appropriated for the promotion of national labor. Over 80,000 men are soon given jobs in Autobahn construction alone. Tax relief in favor of the common people is an additional burden to the treasury.
Strong shoulders should carry a heavy load. Weak shoulders should be spared. National debt was not an issue at the time. One of Hitler's first measures was to put a stop to the publishing of the Reich budget for 1934 and subsequently, which means that the budget became a secret internal matter. No one spoke to the public about debt, and there was no mention of it in newspapers either. The public was unaware.
One of Goebbels' most dangerous strategies was the creation of an enemy that justified oppression, violence, and ultimately genocide. Jewish communities were vilified through every possible medium. Newspapers published false stories, accusing them of corruption, greed, and treachery. Posters depicted them as threats to the purity and safety of German society. That infamous film, The Eternal Jew, did not simply spread anti-Semitic stereotypes, it dehumanized an entire population. It framed Jewish citizens as parasites, as dangerous to civilization, as being undeserving of sympathy. This relentless messaging had a terrifying effect. Over time, the German people did not merely accept Jewish exclusion, they participated in it. The April 1st, 1933 boycott was a direct result of this propaganda. It marked the first widespread action in which Nazi messaging translated into real consequences, where businesses were abandoned, livelihoods were destroyed, and the people were reduced to symbols of hatred rather than human beings. Goebbels ensured that German citizens were constantly surrounded by Nazi ideology. Radios were being played in homes, workplaces, and public spaces, so that Hitler's voice was never far away.
So on the 1st of May 1934, crowds of people flood open-air areas all over Germany to listen to the broadcast of Hitler's speech on the Day of National Labour. The footage here is from the Thingstedt near Halle, an outdoor amphitheatre designed on the format of ancient Germanic models. In Berlin's Lustgarten, the Reich Chancellor proclaims his vision for the future of the nation before an audience of over 2 million people.
Was wir vom kommenden Deutschland ersehnen und erwarten, das müsst ihr, meine Jungen und Mädchen, erfüllen.
Slogans became part of daily life. Children were taught in schools that Nazi ideals were absolute truths, ensuring that from a young age they had no exposure to independent thought. To further eliminate opposition, Goebbels crafted a climate of fear. Any German who questioned the messaging was at risk of imprisonment, at risk of exile, at risk of death. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, ensured that those who disagreed with Nazi propaganda faced consequences. Through this system, people not only believed Nazi ideology, they feared contradicting it. Joseph Goebbels did not commit mass murder. He did not oversee concentration camps. He did not personally carry out executions. And yet, without his work, the Holocaust could not have happened.
On the 21st of March 1933, Hitler's head of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, stages the opening ceremony for the new Reichstag in Potsdam to demonstrate reconciliation between the Nazi movement and the old Prussia. Hitler shuns the party uniform for a tailcoat and acts as a humble servant of the state. An observer comments, he has undeniably grown.
21st of March 1933 was symbolically very important. Day was chosen as the first day. Originally, it was going to be the opening of the new Reichstag was going to be in April. They moved it to the 21st of March, being a symbolic day, the first day of spring, also the day on which Bismarck held the first Reichstag after the German unification of 1871. More importantly still, though, this was the moment at which old Prussia, came together with the new Germany. Everything was done, therefore, to represent the coming together of the old and the new, and this was the symbolic moment at which the old elites met up with the representatives of the new Germany, the Nazi leadership.
An amateur filmmaker from Marburg documents the Day of Potsdam with his camera. On his way to the garrison church, Reich President von Hindenburg inspects the guards of honor from the army and the Stormtroopers. At the tomb of Friedrich the Great, von Hindenburg, as the representative of the old era, and Hitler as the herald of the new age, demonstrate unanimity. The old man willingly lets himself be used by the propaganda. The Social Democrats do not attend the staged event. 2 days later, they are the only party in the Reichstag to vote against Hitler's Enabling Act, which will systematically strip Germany of the last remnants of democracy.
Goebbels understood that before genocide could take place, a foundation had to be built. A foundation of lies, of deception, of a world where hatred was considered truth. He proved that propaganda is more than a persuasion. It is control, it is manipulation, and it is the quiet force behind oppression.
The army.
Shortly afterwards, Hitler travels to Bayreuth to visit Winifred Wagner, who had been Röhm's friend since the early days of the movement. Remaining cool and self-assured during their private talk, he justifies the purge to her, arguing that in the end, only 77 people had been executed. Charlemagne, too, had had to slay the rebellious Saxons before he set the foundations for his empire, but as everyone knows, was later canonized. His own acts were all based on the principle that everything that was of service to the German people was good, Hitler tells her. By the end of their relaxed conversation, Richard Wagner's daughter-in-law was persuaded of Röhm's disloyalty.
Winifred Wagner was the ideal person for the Redeemer image they wanted to project, being the successor of composer Richard Wagner, of whom Hitler was a great fan. The two of them appearing together at the Bayreuth Festival before the performers and the other Wagnerians was a demonstration of Hitler's elevation to a different social class.
Each summer, Bayreuth becomes the cultural center of the Third Reich. Everybody who considers themselves important in Nazi Germany journeys to the Richard Wagner Festspiele, whether they are Wagner fans or not. Wolfgang Wagner, the composer's grandson, captures the arrival of the guests with his private camera. Before the performance, Hitler is seen by the window with another grandson, Wieland. After Ernst Röhm's execution, the role of his stormtroopers in Bayreuth, as in the entire Third Reich, is more or less decorative. Here, Wieland and Wolfgang Wagner are marching at the front of a parade of the stormtroopers before the festival theater. On the 2nd of August 1934, Reich President von Hindenburg dies at the age of 86. The coffin is transported to the East Prussian town of Tannenberg, where it is interred in a pompous funeral ceremony. Without delay, Hitler does away with the official position.
This was a critical period for Hitler, naturally. And it was important, therefore, to build up the image of Hitler as the symbol of national unity, in particular after just what had happened. So on Hindenburg's death, then he takes over, becomes then the head of state. An oath of allegiance is sworn to him, which is then, the oath of allegiance, interestingly enough, is suggested not by Hitler himself, but by the Reichswehr minister von Blomberg.
From now on, Hitler is the Führer and Chancellor of all Germans.
Adolf Hitler!
The beginning of systematic oppression, Nazi Germany's early discrimination laws. Discrimination does not always begin with violence. It does not always begin with persecution in its most blatant form. Sometimes it begins with laws. Laws designed not to protect, but to exclude. Laws that strip away rights, dignity, and identity, piece by piece, until a people are no longer seen as citizens, but as outsiders. This is how oppression becomes normalized. This is how injustice disguises itself as legality. And in Nazi Germany, the systematic persecution of Jewish citizens began not only with concentration camps, but with legislation, carefully crafted, deliberately enforced, and ruthlessly designed to isolate an entire population. In the months following Hitler's rise to power, Nazi leadership wasted no time in codifying anti-Semitic laws into being. The first major step came in April 1933, which we talked about, just weeks after the Nazi regime was established. When Jewish professionals were the initial targets, lawyers, doctors, teachers, and civil servants were forced out of their professions under new regulations that banned them from working in public institutions. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, passed on April 7, 1933, declared that all Jews and political opponents of the Nazi Party be removed from government positions. For many Jewish families, this meant immediate financial devastation. Careers built over decades were destroyed in a matter of days. A sense of belonging, of citizenship, was ripped away, leaving thousands struggling to survive. With professional exclusion underway, Nazi lawmakers continued to tighten their grip. In September of 1933, the Reich Chamber of Cultural Law barred Jewish artists, musicians, and writers from participating in Germany's cultural life. Their works were censored, their voices silenced, and their influence erased from public sphere. Education soon became another battleground. By 1935, Jewish students were expelled from German schools, forbidden from learning alongside their former classmates. Universities refused Jewish applicants, ensuring that the next generation of Jewish youth would have no opportunities for advancement. Economic pressure intensified. Laws restricted Jewish businesses' ownerships, preventing them from operating freely in the marketplace. Banks refused Jewish clients and landlords turned them away, and entire neighborhoods were reshaped by forced evictions. The Nuremberg Laws was the most infamous legal measures came in September 1935 when the Nazi regime enacted the Nuremberg Laws, a critical turning point in Jewish persecution. Under these laws, Jewish people were officially stripped of German citizenship, designated as subjects rather than citizens of the Reich. This meant they no longer had legal protections, could not vote, and had no rights under the government they once called their own. The Nuremberg Laws also dictated personal relationships. The law for the protection of German blood and honor criminalized marriage and sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews, further isolating them from society. The intent was clear: to erase Jewish identity, to dismantle their role in German life, and to make them outsiders in their own country.
The destruction of the Reichstag on the 27th of February 1933 signals the demise of the Weimar Republic. Hitler had been in power no more than 4 weeks when Dutch communist Marinus van der Lubbe sets the building on fire. The Reichstag is gutted by the flames. Hitler uses the opportunity to settle the score with his political opponents. An emergency decree suspends most civil liberties in Germany. The newspapers of the Communist and Social Democratic parties are banned and many functionaries arrested. The police are encouraged to use their weapons without hesitation against so-called subversive organizations and demonstrators. Nazi combat groups are given police powers. Working-class leaders who have just finished their speeches in front of huge audiences are driven out of the Union buildings by gangs of thugs. Hitler is hoping to win by a comfortable margin in the election and gain the majority in order to push through a dictatorial rule.
The Reichstag Fire decree and how civil liberties were eroded. Freedom is fragile. It is not taken away in an instant, but dismantled piece by piece, often under the guise of security necessity. Throughout history, authoritarian regimes have understood that people will surrender their liberties if they believe it is for their own protection. In Germany, this lesson was mastered by Adolf Hitler and his Nazi government, and nowhere was it more evident than in the aftermath of the Reichstag Fire. The burning of the German Parliament building on February 27, 1933 was the perfect crisis for a government seeking absolute power. Within hours, the Nazi Party framed the fire as an act of terrorism, blaming communists and political dissidents for attempting to overthrow the state. The next day, Hitler and his closest advisors moved swiftly, crafting legislation that would give them unprecedented control over German society. The Reichstag Fire decree was signed into law in February 1933. It was presented as an emergency measure for the protection of the German people, but in reality, it was a death knell of democracy in Germany. With this single decree, civil liberties were wiped away, opposition was silenced, and the foundation of dictatorship was laid. Tonight, we will examine how this moment reshaped Germany and how it served as a warning that freedom, once lost, is difficult to reclaim. The Reichstag Fire decree, officially titled the Decree for the Protection of People and State, allowed the government to suspend fundamental rights overnight. It abolished freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and personal protections against unlawful imprisonment. These were not small alterations, they were sweeping erasures of democracy. The decree granted the Nazi government the ability to imprison individuals without cause, suppress political opposition, and seize control of media outlets. Newspapers critical of Hitler were shut down, journalists were arrested, and books that contradicted Nazi ideology were banned. Political parties that opposed the Nazi regime, especially the communists and socialists, became immediate targets. Thousands were arrested, including members of the Reichstag who had spoken out against Hitler's policies. With opposition weakened and voices silenced, Hitler had free rein to shape Germany as he saw fit. The path to dictatorship. The Reichstag Fire decree was only the first step. Just weeks later, Hitler pushed for even greater authority. On March 23, 1933, the Enabling Act was passed, officially granting him the ability to rule by decree without needing parliamentary approval. The Nazi government justified each oppressive measure as necessary for national security, convincing citizens that the loss of their freedoms was a fair price to pay for stability. With full control secured, Hitler dismantled all remaining democratic institutions. Opposition parties were banned, labor unions dissolved, and the Gestapo, the secret police, was given unlimited authority to hunt down those who resisted. The legal framework that once protected individuals had been completely rewritten to serve Nazi interests.
Niemals noch seit es einen deutschen Reichstag gibt, ist die Kontrolle der öffentlichen Angelegenheiten durch die gewählten Vertreter des Volkes in solchem Maße ausgeschaltet worden, wie das jetzt geschieht. Und wie das durch das neue Ermächtigungsgesetz noch mehr geschehen soll. Eine solche Allmacht der Regierung muss sich umso schwerer auswirken, als auch die Presse jeder Bewegungsfreiheit entbehrt. Meine Damen und Herren, die Zustände, die heute in Deutschland herrschen, werden vielfach in krassen Farben geschildert. Wie immer in solchen Fällen fehlt es auch nicht an Übertreibungen. Was meine Partei betrifft, erkläre ich hier, wir haben weder in Paris um Intervention gebeten, noch Millionen nach Prag verschoben, noch übertreibende Nachrichten ins Ausland gebracht. Solchen Übertreibungen entgegenzutreten, wäre leichter, wenn im Inland eine Berichterstattung möglich wäre, die Wahres vom Falschen scheidet. Noch besser wäre es, wenn wir mit gutem Gewissen bezeugen könnten, dass die volle Rechtssicherheit für alle wiederhergestellt sei. Diese Möglichkeit zu geben, das, meine Herren, liegt bei Ihnen. Die Herren von der Nationalsozialistischen Partei nennen die von Ihnen entfesselte Bewegung eine nationale Revolution, nicht eine nationalsozialistische. Das Verhältnis Ihrer Revolution zum Sozialismus beschränkt sich bisher auf den Versuch, die sozialdemokratische Bewegung zu vernichten.
The Enabling Act and the Consolidation of Nazi Power. During this time, Jewish professionals were expelled from workplaces in April of 1933. There was education and exclusion. The Jewish children were barred from schools. There were book burnings and censorship, silencing opposition. And there were growing international concerns and lack of intervention.
On the morning of New Year's Day, Adolf Hitler greets army and units of the Stormtroopers in the court of the Chancellery. Germany's resurgence, he proclaims, will continue inexorably in the new year. The first step towards the end is the Saar plebiscite on the 13th of January. During the period preceding the referendum, Joseph Goebbels pulls out all the stops of National Socialist propaganda. But the opponents of Saarland's unification with Germany are also very active. In the end, an overwhelming majority of the population votes in favor of returning home to the Reich. For mainly economic reasons, over 90% choose the Nazi regime.
The Saar plebiscite was just a lucky break for Hitler. The Saarland was an area which was heavily Catholic and had a big working class component. So the two groups that had been mostly resistant towards the allures of National Socialism in the run-up to power in Germany dominated the area which is now the subject of the plebiscite. When the results of the plebiscite came out, the vote to return to Germany was just under 91%, which was a phenomenal result for the Nazi leadership, a brilliant achievement of propaganda there as well. But it meant now that this was a legitimation for Hitler, both internally, but also more importantly, externally in the eyes of the world outside. Hitler had now achieved this great result. He was popular even in an area which had the alternative choices in front of it.
Democracy does not crumble in an instant. It is not overturned by a single decree. Whether it is dismantled in stages, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through fear. In Nazi Germany, the most defining moment in the destruction of democratic rule came in March 23, 1933, with the passing of the Enabling Act. This legislation did not simply grant Hitler additional authority, it eliminated parliamentary oversight, silenced opposition, and placed unchecked power in the hands of one man. The Enabling Act marked the formal beginning of dictatorship in Germany. Economic persecution is often the first step toward social destruction. Before Jewish communities were physically targeted, their ability to work, provide, and exist within German society was methodically dismantled. April 1933 saw the passage of the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which forced Jewish professionals, lawyers, doctors, teachers, out of their careers. This was not an isolated action. It was a calculated step toward broader marginalization, designed to erode Jewish participation in German life. The financial devastation and loss of status, the social isolation and increasing restrictions, and the role of propaganda in justifying professional exclusion. The destruction of Jewish livelihoods was not an unintended consequence, it was a goal. The April 1933 law set a precedent that would lead to more devastating policies, culminating in total extermination. It is our duty to remember and recognize the early warnings of persecution. The silent suffering, the expulsion of Jewish children from education. The fate of a society lies in its children. When a government denies education to an entire population, it is not merely restricting access to learning, it is ensuring long-term erasure. From 1933 onward, Jewish students were methodically removed from schools. They were expelled from classrooms, denied the right to learn alongside their peers, and forced into isolation. This exclusion was part of a larger effort to dehumanize Jewish families and sever the connection to German society. The legal measures taken against Jewish education. There was the exclusion of Jewish students in public schools, the closure of Jewish institutions and forced segregations, the impact on Jewish educators and scholars, the psychological toll. There was isolation and humiliation in daily life, the destruction of hope for future generations, and personal accounts of Jewish students facing discrimination. Education shapes minds, futures, and society itself. When Jewish children were denied the right to learn, they were denied the right to belong. Their suffering serves as a reminder that exclusion is not just an act of oppression, it is an act of destruction. The book burnings and censorship. Erasing Thought: How Nazi Germany Used Censorship to Control Minds. To control a nation, one must first control its ideas. In Nazi Germany, censorship was not just a policy, it was a tool of domination. Books that challenged the regime's ideology were burned. Journalists who exposed truth were imprisoned. Intellectual thought was labeled as dangerous, while blind loyalty was encouraged. May 10, 1933, saw one of the most infamous acts of censorship in history: the Nazi-led book burnings. Across Germany, thousands of literary works were destroyed in public spectacles designed to eliminate dissent. The book burnings. It was targeted at Jewish and liberal authors. The destruction of philosophical and scientific works, and it suppressed free thought. It controlled the newspapers and media, and it imprisoned writers and journalists. The banning of intellectual discussions. A society that burns books is one that fears knowledge. Nazi Germany proved that censorship is more than an attack on ideas, it's an attack on humanity itself. Let us ensure that truth always triumphs over tyranny. History does not only judge those who commit atrocities, it judges those who allow them to happen. The world watched as Nazi Germany stripped Jews of their rights, burned their books, and excluded them from society. And yet action was slow, hesitation prevailed, and intervention was avoided. Warnings were there. The Nazi agenda was not hidden, but governments turned away, choosing diplomacy over confrontation, neutrality over responsibility. We're going to explore why international powers failed to respond and how their silence shaped the face of millions. The early warnings. The global reaction to Nazi rhetoric in the 1920s. The reports from journalists and diplomats on persecution. The political reluctance to confront Hitler and the missed opportunities for intervention. The failures of foreign governments to act. The role of appeasement in political strategy, and the consequences of ignoring growing tyranny. The Holocaust was not inevitable. The world had chances to intervene before extermination began, and yet hesitation allowed injustice to flourish. Let us learn from these failures and recognize that silence in the face of oppression is never neutral. It is complicity. Join me in episode 3, where we start to cover the concentration camps. Thank you for listening, and have a good day, guys.